Thank you, Sarah. Can you hear me okay? Great. Thank you. Thank you very much, everyone, for attending today. So, as Sarah said, this webinar today is about creating expense reporting solutions and approval solutions using QuizCon forms. And everything I'm going to show you today is not complicated, it's not technical, there's not going to be lots of coding or anything else like that. I'm going to start with a few slides just to explain and set the scene a bit, and then we'll go through a series of demos. So QuizCon Forms is really about converting your rather plain SharePoint forms into rich forms. And that can be in a number of different ways in terms of layout of those forms, with tabs and different groupings of fields. And that can also be by introducing those relationships between different sorts of lists. And we'll show you that during the demo today. Ooh, wrong way. And the key thing to remember is QuizCon Forms app is SharePoint hosted. So when you're dealing with form information, especially sort of sensitive information, none of that data leaves your tenant like some of the other solutions out there. And one of the nice things which I'm going to show you today is the new SPFX modern forms from QuizCon. So it's going to use a modern UI using the Microsoft Fluent UI design. And so it's going to look familiar. It's going to look like modern SharePoint. It's fully responsive. So I'm working on a laptop today, but it will work in big screens. It will work on your mobile device as well. There is still support, obviously, for classic SharePoint as well if you're still using that. So I think to start with, I'm just going to show you a brief demo. I'm going to show you the scenario of a user coming in using a form in QuizCon Forms to populate data into lists. So all of this data goes into lists. And I'm going to show you things like the idea of having a header, so the general details about my expense, and then also the expense lines. And then I'm going to show you how we can introduce things like validation, default values, business rules essentially to those to that form. And then I'll show you a little bit about how we can then manage workflow type actions. So you may well know that SharePoint 2010 workflows are moving out of support and being retired by Microsoft. And so I'll show you how QuizCon forms can replace those workflows, which perhaps you've already got in place and you're looking for a replacement for. So I'll show you some of that as well. But initially, we'll just show you the user story of someone requesting some expenses to be paid and an approval component, and then we'll delve into what actually has been set up here. So I'm going to be using a couple of users today for the purposes of my demo. The first user I'm using is Joe. So he's a regular user of SharePoint. He's not going to be one of the approvers. He's not an administrator as part of my setup. Notice also when he comes into this list, he only sees a single view called My Expenses. So this is my view of expenses here, and I can see I've submitted one already for July. So let's fill one out now. And the important thing to say is this is just sitting on top of your SharePoint list. So you're creating your SharePoint columns as you do before. There's some advanced column capability, which I'll show you, but this is enhancing the existing SharePoint experience, which you're comfortable and used to. So immediately you'll notice, so modern look and feel, if you've seen perhaps the previous versions of QuizCon forms, and immediately a richer layout, full screen as well, not loading in a little bit of the screen like maybe some of the other solutions like Power Apps do. I'm seeing a full screen here, and I'm laying out my fields across a series of tabs here. So I've got a summary tab and I've got an expenses tab. So I'll just say, well, I'm going to fill out August expenses. I'm going to set what department I'm in. So in this case, filling it in for sales. Claim date, well, I'm happy with this date. I'll do it today. And then note some of these fields are locked. So I can't change the status. It's picking me up automatically as the person who submitted it. And again, I can't change that. What I can go and change is I can go and add some expenses. So if I click on the tab here, what we'll immediately notice is one of those biggest challenges which organizations have had for many years, and maybe they previously did via InfoPath or some custom development, being able to put multiple rows inside of a form when you're actually just filling out a single item in SharePoint. And what Quiz Conforms is doing is creating repeating rows. So it's linking a header table, in this case my expenses report list, and linking it to another list containing all of my expenses. And I'll show you how that's done later on during this demo. So I'm just going to go and add a few expenses. So let's say I've got a hotel stay I did, and I want to pick a certain category. So it was accommodation. I notice how my subcategory is relevant to my main category. So let's say it was $200. And I can add an attachment so I can manage my expenses. I've just got for simplicity, I've just got a couple of pictures, which I'll just add in. And let's add in another line so we can see a bit more of that logic. So in this case, if I'm selecting travel, notice the options I have available here are different. So I'll say it's a flight, and in this case I'll say it was $800. Now I don't need to add a third row here. It displayed certain default rows. I can remove that row. I can add in additional rows here. So very easily being able to add relevant rows to my expenses claim, or whatever you're using and entering rows for. Now I'm going to hit save here and submit my expense, and I want to show you what's going to happen. So it's saying I've entered some invalid values, and that's because I've introduced some data validation rules using Quiz Conforms, and in this case I can't claim over $500 for flights, so we'll adjust that accordingly, and I'll save that. And this has just created me a SharePoint list item. There's a few other things going on behind the scenes, but it's just created me that list item. Just wait for that to load up, give that a quick refresh, and we can see my item in there with a status of submitted, which is my default status. There we see it there. Yeah. We can also see that it's automatically set Peter as the approver, which conveniently is my other user I'm using today. So I've just switched to another browser session, and I can see that Peter, I'm logged in as Peter now. If I have a quick look at my email, I'll have got an email notification telling me that there's a new expense submitted by Joe. And I've actually got a link here which will open the form itself, and I can go and have a look and review the expenses. And when it loads up, we'll notice we get a few additional options here. So I can see a bit more of the form. If I come in and edit it, notice that the status field is active for me. And there's lots of different ways we could handle the approval. I've done it using just a status field. We could create a task for someone in a task list. We could add a button to the form which someone clicks to approve the expenses. All of those options are available with Quiz Conforms. I'm just going to go in here and I'm going to approve the request. And I'm going to save that. Now, the other thing which I wanted to show you was when I'm in this expenses reports list, sure, my default view is my expenses, but I also have access to the all items view, where I can see all of the claims done by individual users. And in this case, because I'm using the view permissions capability within Quiz Conforms, I can control who should see and who shouldn't see specific views. So again, locking down and controlling what is displayed to users. And if I return to Joe now, I can see that my status has been updated of approved. Now I haven't built out an additional step within my approval to notify Joe that it's been approved, but I'll show you how to do that during the course of the demo. So that just tells you the story of how a simple expense report and approval solution could be implemented using QuizCon forms. So let me just return to PowerPoint for a minute and just talk about some of the different components which we're using, and then we'll look at how those bits are set up. So we talked about being able to control the field layouts on the form. So I'll show you a little bit about how we configure those form layouts. I'll show you how we lock fields under either different form conditions or based on different fields. So it might be that while the status is submitted, certain fields are hidden or certain fields are locked. And we can also look up data from other lists, even different sites, and I'll show you both of those. I'll show you how the repeating rows functionality works and how we link that up, and also how validation rules implemented in those repeating rows show within the main form. So you can use the QuizCon rules within their engine to build that validation at the other levels as well. I'll show you and talk to you about cascading lookups as well. So how we can do one field affects the value of the other. So I showed you that with the expenses category. I selected travel and that restricted my sub options, as well as that field validation, which I talked about. Finally, I'll look at the workflow side of things. I'll look at activities as reusable pieces, and then actions to do something within a specific forms process. I'll show you how we can do both simple and complex workflows, and I'll take a look at the view permissions as well so we can see all of those things in action. So quite a lot to go through. I'll show you a lot of what I've built because I think it will take us perhaps a little bit too long in the webinar today to build it all from scratch, but I'll show you building out specific bits during the course of outlining these. So I'm returning as Peter because Peter is the admin. I've kept it simple. My approver is my admin for the purposes of the demo today. Notice I've got access to the QuizCon forms option within my ribbon here. If I go into that, I'll access my expenses report list. And when I do that, I'm presented with a number of different sections to this form, which I can then configure. One of those is the form layout. So in here, I get a canvas where I can design the layout of my form. I can add groupings. So in this case, I've added the one grouping called summary, and I've defined the number of columns. And I can add additional rows and select my columns to include. And I can add additional groupings. So in this case, I've added another one for my expenses grouping as well. So here I can design the layout of my form. I can also implement conditions. So I can implement conditions for each of these to define when that specific grouping should be shown, even based on the current user. So if the current user is my particular favorite in a specific group. So we could hide a section of the form, maybe the whole approval section, we could hide unless it's to specific users or groups. Let me show that to you, but first of all, I'm just going to go and set up another field because I want to capture a field for approval comments. So let's go and create a column, and I'm going to create a column for approval comment. We'll just keep it really simple. We'll just make it text, and I'll OK that. Let's return to my list. And then I'm going to go back into QuizCon forms. I'm going to add that field to my form. So I'm just going to add a row, and then I'm going to add my approval comment. And it's really that simple. And if I wanted to put that over 2 columns, I could do. Just remove that spare row, and I'll have that as a 2-column field, just sort of allowing me a bit more space. Now, there's a couple of ways I could control access to this field, because obviously we don't want the people filling it in when it's initially requested. So I could go and create another group and another tab for approval, and hide that tab when it's under specific users. But I'm going to show you how we can actually lock certain fields and how we can introduce some validation rules. So I'm just saving these settings, and I'm going to go to dynamically show and hide fields. So this allows me to do either show, hide, or disable certain fields based on certain conditions or states. So I'm going to come here and I'm going to choose approval comment, and then I'm going to set up a new rule. And I can apply the permissions to various forms. So for simplicity, I'm just going to hide that field on the new form. So it's just not going to be visible in that state. And we have the other states of fields. I could come in here and add an additional condition. So I could base it on current user is equal or member of a specific group, or another state within the form based on certain field data. But I'll keep mine pretty simple. And you can see a few other things I'm doing, like disabling the submitter, hiding the state, disabling the status field apart from to certain users. So I've got lots of opportunity to control how fields are entered. The other thing I can do is set default values. So here I've set a number of default values for my form, a lot more flexible than the native experience. So I've set like the claim date to be today, the submitter to be the current user, set the default status to be submitted. And for each of these, I could, if I wanted to, go and implement a specific rule, what that default value is, and enter a new condition. The other thing I can do is introduce data validation. So it might be that I always want to comment against my approval. We can do that using what's called field constraints. So in here, I can choose my field, and then I can introduce a new rule, and I can say, well, under what condition do I want it to run? So I could say, if it is empty, actually I wanted the other way around. So I'm basically saying if it's, I'm basically putting the opposite in there. So approval comment is a required field, and it's come up with a simple message for me, and I can adjust this error message and highlight that field. And I can introduce a condition. So for example, I could say where the status is equal to certain options or not equal to certain options. Okay, so I can introduce additional validation into my form as well. So that's simply introducing new fields, assigning some rules to it. What else can we do? Well, we can also use lookup fields and more advanced lookup fields. And I'll show you two examples of this. Firstly, I'll look at my lookup field within my form. So I selected a department during my demo. And we can either create a new column or I can have a look at one of the ones which I've already defined. So I'm going to have a look at the department column. And notice that I'm selecting from a site, and that's actually a different site to the one I'm using. So I'm actually using a different site here, and in this site I've got my list of departments. So when I'm configuring a lookup column, which is not possible in a native experience, I can select which site I want to look up against. So in this case, I'm looking at a different site, defining which list and what column I'm using. So more advanced capabilities around lookup columns as well, especially if you've got a central list you're reusing in a number of different forms. The other thing I can do is I can create those repeating tables we've seen. And firstly, let me just show you the child list which I'm using. So think about the idea of headers and footers, and that's essentially what we're doing here. We've got the child items here in my list called expenses. And in here, all of my expenses lines are recorded. So you see all of my different expenses lines, and they're linked to a parent item. So in this case, the item within my expenses reports list. I can also introduce rules using QuizCom forms to this list. So to each row being added, we can add rules and validation. And I've done that in a couple of ways. Firstly, I've introduced some lookups. So I've defined a couple of columns here. I've defined my expenses category. So I'm looking up and I've got a list defined within my site called main category. Yeah. And that's just got a few of those top level categories defined within it. So you see travel, accommodation, technology. And then I've got another list called subcategory, where I've got those subcategories and a lookup to the relevant main category they're defined for. Yeah. So a simple reference table essentially. So in my expenses category, very simple, I'm looking at the current site and I'm choosing the main category. Notice I can do things like filter based on a certain view. So for example, I could mark certain categories as inactive or disabled, and they wouldn't be presented in the options for users, but the relationships would still remain. I've also then defined a subcategory. And in here, I've said that I want to filter by another column in my list. So I'm filtering by expense category, and then I'm filtering by the main category column in that subcategory list. So I'm filtering it based on this. So ensuring that only my relevant items are displayed. Finally, I'm introducing some data validation. So we saw the piece around a flight that if it was over a certain amount, that it wasn't allowed. So how have we done that? We did that via field constraints, which I showed you earlier, but in this case, we're putting field constraints against the individual item being added, so that row within the expenses. So here I'm saying, well, what's my validation rule? If it's less than 500, it's okay. Otherwise, show this error message. And then I've put a filter on that to say if subcategory equals flights. So I'll do another one to show you the idea. So I could say if the value is less than, let's say, $250, then we're okay. And I want it to be for any subcategory of hotels. So I could then put in an error message text saying, yeah, so I can easily put in another validation rule based in this case on that filter. So I can define a number of different rules about how my rows are entered. Okay. So how do I link that to my expenses report? So I've got this list here with some rules and validation on. Well, again, I link that child list to my main list using QuizCon forms. And in here, I introduce that by using repeating rows. And we can support multiple repeating row columns within a single list. And in here, I'll select my existing one so I can show you. And I can define how many default rows to display, what that text actually is. So in this case, I want people to add new expense for when they want to add an additional row. I select what list it's being stored in, and then I select the columns and can even configure the layout of those columns. So I can basically define within my master list a column which is my repeating rows. And then I link that to my form because it's now a field within my list, or it's seen as a field within my list. So in my layout, I can come in to here and I can choose expenses as a column, and that repeating row will then be shown. So that's the layout, repeating rows, various validation and default values. A few last things to show you. Firstly, view permissions. So the fact that certain users couldn't see the all items view. Really simple to do. So I can apply a rule here. I can say, well, what am I doing? Am I showing or hiding that view? And then I'm basing that on a value. And in this case, I'm basing it on something about the current user. And I like to use groups. So I'm saying when they're not part of my owners group for my site. Finally, let's have a look at workflow. And workflow is made up of two components. Firstly, activities, where we define certain things which will happen, and then an action which packages them together as either something a user does or something automatically which happens. So both types of workflow. So we can create a series of activities. So firstly, I've got an activity which goes and gets the approver. And we can support a variety of activities, such as getting a column value, adding items to lists if you wanted to assign a task to someone, for example, sending emails, setting item permissions, really important if we're trying to move away from SharePoint 2010 workflows, and various other actions, including calling web services. And then I can go and get an item, in this case, again, from a different site, so not the same site. I can select my target list. and I can then filter it based on a value from my form. So anything which is a value, I can select, which is in this case department, and I'm going to retrieve the column approver. Next, I'm going to set the approver within my current item in my expenses report list. In this case, I'm updating the existing item, so it's updating the current item. And I'm going to set the approver, in this case, to be just a parameter. So I'm setting this and I'm going to use this later. And QuizCom helpfully provides some great instructions on how to either use system tokens or variables. So I'm setting a variable for my approver, which I'll define later when I'm configuring my action. This allows me to create reusable activities, essentially. Finally, I'm going to notify my approver. So I'm going to send an email. Again, I'm going to use my little variable I've defined of approver. And then I've put some various text in here, including where I've put square brackets to define fields from my item. I've then packaged these up in an action which will happen, so like a workflow. And I've only got one action. And there are two types of actions available. Either an automatic item which runs under a certain condition, so an item being added to a list, edited, deleted, or a button which someone initiates. So I could have done a button which someone clicks to approve that item. And in here, I then define a series of activities. So I add my get approver activity. Note this provides me with an output, which I can then set using my variable each time. So I can set my output and I can set my output. So it's dynamic and relevant to my activity. Let's quickly show you configuring a simple activity and a simple action. So say we wanted to send a notification to the user who requested the expense. So let's create one called expenses outcome. And I'm going to send the email to my requester. So in this case, I'm using square brackets to link to the person who submitted it. Let me just check I've used the right column name. When SharePoint decides to wake up, I'll just check that. Oh no, I called it submitter, so let me get that right. Perfect. And then I can do things like your expense has been, and then I could put status because it could either be approved or rejected. And then let's put that same text again, but I could then put by approver, so picking up the approver value set for my list. And I could even go with the following comments. Now we've set up our activity, we need to link that to and create an action using it. At this point, I've only got one activity, but I could have a series of other things. I could send a notification to finance to pay the person. I could create tasks. I could do whatever I want here. So I'll have an automatic action, and I'll say when the item is updated, we'll call it approval outcome. and I'll say I only want it when the status is not equal to submitted, so it has to have been either approved or rejected, and I'll just send that piece. Now I've sort of put those in there, but I could have used variables there as well. And so I've added my other actions to my secondary workflow. Much quicker to build than a SharePoint workflow, and certainly much quicker than using something like Power Automate. So that's my solution updated. Let's have a little look at that in action, and then we'll have time for a few questions. So I've switched back to, no I haven't, I've switched back to Joe now, and I'm going to submit another expense. And I'm going to show you just how some of those fields are hidden, some of my extra validation, etc. So notice the approval comments isn't displayed. So let's say we're doing September expenses and set my department. Go and add some expenses lines. So just to prove we've got some other categories in here. I've got technology. I can say something about my phone. Let's say that's $50. Let's get rid of one of these lines, and then we'll submit another one for a hotel stay in London, let's say. And I would want that. And I'll say it was £1,000. London's quite expensive to stay in if you haven't been there. And I'll go and select my file so I can add an attachment. And then I'll hit save. And hopefully my validation will say the maximum I can claim for a hotel is $250. Oh, well, okay. I've got expensive tastes. So my expense has been submitted. We'll switch back over to Peter. I'll have got a new expense report to approve. If I click on that link to open it up, and we'll edit this and approve, and hopefully we should see our approval comments as well. And I'm going to edit the expense now. And do you see I get the approval comments, which I didn't see when I was in as the other user. So I'm going to say I'm not happy with these. Notice how also these are not, this is displayed across two columns. I'm going to set it as rejected, and then I'm going to save it. And hopefully as a final step, if I return to Joe, he should have hopefully received an email telling him that his request was rejected and why. There you can see my email telling me my expense has been rejected. Notice how the email text is dynamic, including the approver and comments. If we switch back briefly to the admin user Peter, we can look at the QuizCom custom action history list. This list is very useful for troubleshooting any problems which you've got with your actions and activities in your QuizCon forms. Wrap up with a quick summary, and then we'll have some time for some questions. So I guess the key things for me are that QuizCon Forms is easy to configure by non-technical users. I've done it all within the browser. I haven't had to open up other applications. I haven't had to use complex coding or design tools to achieve any of this. For me, there's a few things which it does really nicely. It addresses that challenge of related lists, so parent and child items, which has always been a challenge in SharePoint. So whether that's expenses headers and expenses lines, quote header, quote lines, it does that really neatly and simply, whilst allowing you still to do the validation both at the top level list and the lower level items, whether that's data validation, default values, locking, hiding, showing fields under various conditions. And very simply, you can replace your existing workflow processes without the need for, learning a tool like Power Automate. And you can quickly build those workflow actions up and replace those SharePoint workflows which are potentially being retired for you. And with that, thank you. And hopefully we've had a few questions during the course of the last 40 minutes or so. So I'll let Sarah ask those and we'll try our best to answer them now for you.